while I was back making plans for more Monsters Inc. videos, finally talking about them more often than my pitiful excuse of continuing Incredibles videos on this channel, I really stumbled upon thinking about the cancel plans of the sequel, ones that many videos have mentioned before in the past and the details that have shown up. Because most of us in the public know that Monsters did do something interesting in Pixar compared to the rest of these sequels to most beloved films with doing a prequel like Monsters University, and that truly by itself is still a good film for what it is that I will mention later, doing something different and unique that I thought some Disney animations could benefit from and trying something different instead of continuing this slate of 2s and 3s. And then thinking, why this franchise never had a direct sequel, doing the other things in the first place. This of course is more of an extension after the explosive success of Inside Out 2 as the highest grossing animated film that worked, opening up the possibility of more sequels for that franchise that we have to accept. This of course is coming after the fact that a series like Monsters at Work also exists after its second season, which is in fact also a sequel to the original film, having the main cast returning from both films and also putting in a bit of a new direction. Where because something like that exists, why would you find yourself questioning why should I even make this video in the first place, or actually wondering why do we even need a Monsters Inc. 2? Well, the first reason to mention something like this working is of course exploring the original plans of that sequel that could have worked being a movie that was going to be produced by Disney themselves rather than Pixar, and the one other plans that they announced that was going to be produced by Pixar instead of Disney television animation like this series, and of course Pixar's continued critical and financial success after minor setbacks. Like, you have to go back to see films like Inside Out we just mentioned, Dory, Incredibles, and even Cars, and you still wonder what they could have done with this franchise, particularly comparing its present to the past if that was actually to be shown. Because Monsters today is probably the most interesting franchise that they have produced to date, speaking in terms of their selection of a series and the movies, when most of these other Pixar films have just gone down a successive path of sequels focusing on one or more situations. The time where sequels actually had a new name attached to it instead of just slapping a number 2 beside the damn film because it's just too hard to come up with titles anymore, with the development of a film called Lost in Scaradise being the one in question. Because not long after Monsters Inc. came out, if you know the story, there were already some plans existing for a sequel back in 2002, the time when Disney was helping produce these Pixar films that they owned the rights to make content surrounding them like the sequels themselves compared to the original studio of Pixar, the time of embittered war between Michael Eisner and Steve Jobs of Disney versus Pixar of what to do between the two companies, where it was interesting to think that in Disney's eyes with their newly formed and now defunct Circle 7 Animation that they already had plans to form this studio to make Nemo 2, Toy Story 3, and then Monsters. This is where a film like having Lost in Scaradise focus on the journey into the human world trying to find Boo after getting trapped, something that actually sounds like an interesting progression of the story after dealing with those doors that gave us a glance at first and then one interaction with the abominable snowman in the Himalayas itself. It's always been a mystery to explore the human and monster world connection and why they get the energy off our feelings when they travel to such a realm that opens many interesting and great story potential inside of it. Where instead of how Monsters at Work also mainly follows a new group of characters with Mike and Sully involved, they are still the main focus as such characters as much as their own prequel. Now again, I'm not here to discuss the entire plot of the film as that's not the main focus and it's already been explained by many other people, where I'm more about comparing what has been released and thinking about its real potential moving forward. Where the necessary details to take away, however, is comparing a world where only kids can see monsters rather than grown-ups like how we perceive the world and fitting Sully into the role he found himself at last while the others tussle with the next stage of life like Mike trying to marry Celia. Ideas that can provide an interesting direction for the future of someone's life and career path and of course the love of another individual. And of course, more opening up questions of how monsters and humans actually interact, what is a certain specific of people seeing or not seeing them at a certain age that we question when we grow up in the world, just like how Toy Story when we grow up we start forgetting about them. Like, how does that apply into this nature? And of course, how our stuff of legends even exists that we know of monsters like Loch Ness, Bigfoot, Yeti again, and of course Sasquatch or whatever you can think of. The explanations how cultures in the past got these myths to come out, like from gods or goddesses or whatever you can connect in ancient history, but how the true main thing to take away from this plot is that connection Sully has with Boo in terms of monsters and what they truly are on the inside. That its core focus was on the emotional value of the characters like themselves torn between a duty and a passion that even reported it could have been better than the first, but how that sadly all was shelved when Disney finally bought Pixar, where they were free to work on their own projects once again, where any sequel forthcoming would just be fully produced by said studio. Reportedly, Paul John Lasseter didn't even take a look at such plans just to focus on what they specifically want to do, since of course they were the ones who still made the films in the first place, like Toy Story 2 as evident of another great sequel, and how they were not involved with Circle 7 that went under once they bought Pixar. But still sitting on the idea that they were going to do a sequel around 2010 to release it the year Brave came out in 2012. Which that would also bring an interesting idea of what that would actually entail if they were working on that, or somehow similar where this plot slipped back into the cracks, as that involves something unique with the human world and logically continuing the story of Sully and Mike in some form to make it conclusive, but then finding out that this idea instead would become Monsters University as their prequel in 2013. And because that came out, we should just revisit that for the purpose of this film and how that compares to the potential that was lost in some form. This is where they were able to take the story in a unique direction while still focusing on the important events and themes except for major human involvement like these other ideas shown. That we remember now how Monsters University is an underrated movie for telling such a harsh truth, but one still yet motivating for many kids about continuing on even if the odds seem impassable, but using impassibility to an advantage where you know where the characters end up in life, just like Mike. Sure, it might not have the true emotional connection like discovering a father-like relationship between Boo and Sully, but rather straightening the bonds of friendship that Mike and Sully had that transferred into this franchise overall when things seem rough. That we know even when others doubt us, that there are people still there for us, and that's the main thing to take away. That we might still have our disagreements, but how we're able to live past that. Like there is something unique about this film that also makes sense as a precursor as much as Scaradise would have been a successor, focusing on college and university campus lifestyle that moved them up towards Monsters Incorporated as the business working side of life in that future. The career path heading from one stage of life towards the next, like when you enter as a kid and then grow up as an adult and then become elder in the future. That they logically combine the steps to that specific story, thinking an adult life in that way and protecting the youth from harm. I mean, the last point is not kind of the main point, but we still have to factor in how kids ran their world when energy is used. This isn't to say that the original Circle 7 vision doesn't fit into anything that they could do in the future, but when you think about the career-wise path and even Monsters at Work that fits into this picture as well, then maybe the series and the prequel was the best path. Like we mentioned before earlier, that it is still something fresh amidst the ensemble of other Pixar and Disney sequels that were sent straight on the barrage, where honestly having that series tends to work itself out better with the balance between a prequel and the original that can work as an effective sequel. Well, probably not really if you have problems with the series, but you know, you get what I mean when the ideas actually elongate themselves. And of course, all except having Boo return at all still, which was the main point of what the showrunners wanted, compared to the original plans of the sequel that still had her involved. Even mentioning up to Pete Docter himself, who we knew was the original director of Monsters and the overall creative head of Pixar. That even though she remains to be a special part of Sully's heart, people like Pete rather leave it up to the world to interpret as a precious piece on its own rather than having themselves define it. And you can completely understand that perspective when you consider the main goal of a series like this and what it acts like, and again applying what Monsters University itself did as that same message. Of course, the series itself still needs a video on its own to discuss the goods and some bads of having things like that, but still also important to realize that this path was the best that they have chosen. That we also remind ourselves that Pixar is entering an era of having Disney Plus do a bunch of series rather than the original negatives of how COVID impacted Disney to send each film on their own platform. Where again, it's much better with such a series to have such elements of its first and the prequel films combined into each season with the return of other villainous characters that already wiped out the chance of the original planned prequel. That there's much more to explore and much more to see with how characters interact with certain events and other options. We mention this because of how they decided to ultimately go with such different directions, and it seems better off because of those films existing the way that they were. Also because of the fact of what would have happened to Scaradise, where it remains not not to be fully produced by Pixar anyhow, in both terms of this series and the original sequel. And then circling back to the beginning without any of these questions asked, is that could the original plan work the way it did if Disney didn't outright buy Pixar at that very stage? Well, the answer to that would actually be a decent yes for me from what I've seen. Because there's just tons of interesting ideas in that plot if we take into consideration the type of sequel storytelling that Disney had been used to at that point in time that would have been considered one of the best if they had produced that. Following up questions about our own world and the personal relationships that were developed and much more about the future of the company. But then how that idea was never meant to be with the path moving forward, with newer ideas and directions putting up forth a different reality that they actually wanted, and one that also is grateful for producing such meaningful messages in Monsters University. But still, not that everything that they had for that idea cannot work anymore, even if some characters still end up the way that they were, like Randall comparing to a sequel plot in the series, but just how overall monsters in the real world angle can work with involvement from Boo. Apply growing up with the idea of monsters in our youth being those scary beings and also remembering them or not in our own life, combined with this other part that is actually focusing of the career growth of a person like University, where the answer to this old question is that it depends on who decides to work on it. If they stay true to all content that has been released as a viable option, which it can, or else it can become a mediocre side quest like some of the other Pixar sequels had ended up being. So in a world that seems more comfortably fit with more and more sequels as time passes on, I would more agree with the notions that Monsters 2 in some shape or form would have worked to a certain degree, however that idea might have pursued itself. But again, how we moved on in a world that's more accustomed to some ideas in different forms that makes it better, whether it be a prequel or a sequel series. And it rests solely on that final decision alone of how that company may proceed in a near future scenario. With that all said, I'm all done. Goodbye.